Chapter 2, Home, 10th April 1881, by Arthur Conan Doyle. Well, my dear Bertie, here I am again in your postbox. It's not a fortnight since I wrote you that great long letter, and yet you see I have news enough to make another formidable budget. They say that the art of letter writing has been lost, but if quantity may atone for quality, you must confess that, for your sins, you have a friend who has retained it. When I wrote to you last, I was on the eve of going down to join the Cullingworths at Avonmouth, with every hope that he had found some opening for me. I must tell you at some length the particulars of that expedition. I travelled down part of the way with young Leslie Duncan, whom I think you know. He was gracious enough to consider that a third-class carriage and my company were to be preferred to a first class with solitude. You know that he came into his uncle's money a little time ago, and after a first delirious outbreak, he has now relapsed into that dead-heavy state of despair which is caused by having everything which one can wish for. How absurd are the ambitions of life when I think that I, who am fairly happy and as keen as a razor edge, should be struggling for that which I can see has brought neither profit nor happiness to him. And yet, if I can read my own nature, it is not the accumulation of money which is my real aim, but only that I may acquire so much as will relieve my mind of sordid cares and enable me to develop any gifts which I may have undisturbed. My tastes are so simple that I cannot imagine any advantage which wealth can give, save indeed the exquisite pleasure of helping a good man or a good cause. Why should people ever take credit for charity when they must know that they cannot gain as much pleasure out of their guineas in any other fashion? I gave my watch to a broken schoolmaster the other day, having no change in my pocket, and the mater could not quite determine whether it was a trait of madness or of nobility. I could have told her with absolute confidence that it was neither the one nor the other, but a sort of Epicurean selfishness with perhaps a little dash of swagger away down at the bottom of it. What had I ever had from my chronometer like the quiet thrill of satisfaction when the fellow brought me the pawn ticket and told me that the 30 shillings had been useful? Leslie Duncan got out at Carstairs, and I was left alone with a hale, white-haired old Roman Catholic priest who had sat quietly reading his office in the corner. We fell into the most intimate talk, which lasted all the way to Avonmouth. Indeed, so interested was I that I very nearly passed through the place without knowing it. Father Logan, for that was his name, seemed to me to be a beautiful type of what a priest should be, self-sacrificing and pure-minded, with a kind of simple cunning about him and a deal of innocent fun. He had the defects as well as the virtues of his class, for he was absolutely reactionary in his views. We discussed religion with fervor, and his theology was somewhere about the early Pliocene. He might have chattered the matter over with a priest of Charlemagne's court, and they would have shaken hands after every sentence. He would acknowledge this and claim it as a merit. It was consistency in his eyes. If our astronomers and inventors and lawgivers had been equally consistent, where would modern civilization be? Is religion the only domain of thought which is non-progressive, and to be referred forever to a standard set 2,000 years ago? Can they not see that, as the human brain evolves, it must take a wider outlook? A half-formed brain makes a half-formed God, and who shall say that our brains are even half-formed yet? The truly inspired priest is the man or woman with the big brain. It is not the shaven patch on the outside, but it is the 60 ounces within which is the real mark of election. You know that you are turning up your nose at me, Bertie. I can see you do it, but I'll come off the thin ice, and you shall have nothing but facts now. I'm afraid that I should never do for storyteller, for the first stray character that comes along puts his arm in mine and walks me off, with my poor story straggling away to nothing behind me. Well then, it was night when we reached Avonmouth, and as I popped my head out of the carriage window, the first thing that my eyes rested upon was old Cullingworth, standing in the circle of light under a gas lamp. His frock coat was flying open, his waistcoat unbuttoned at the top, and his hat, a top hat this time, jammed on the back of his head, with his bristling hair spurting out in front of it. In every way save that he wore a collar, he was the same Cullingworth as ever. He gave a roar of recognition when he saw me, bustled me out of my carriage, seized my carpet bag, or gripsack as you used to call it, and a minute later we were striding along together through the streets. I was, as you may imagine, all in a tingle to know what it was that he wanted with me. However, as he made no allusion to it, I did not care to ask, and during our longish walk, we talked about indifferent matters. It was football first, I remember, whether Richmond had a chance against Blackheath, and the way in which the new passing game was shredding the old scrimmages. Then he got on to inventions, and became so excited that he had to give me back my bag in order that he might be able to slap all his points home with his fist upon his palm. I can see him now stopping, with his face leaning forward and his yellow tusks gleaming in the lamplight. My dear Munro, this was the style of the thing. Why was armor abandoned? What? I'll tell you why. It was because the weight of metal that would protect a man who was standing up was more than he could carry. But battles are not fought nowadays by men who are standing up. Your infantry are all lying on their stomachs, and it would take very little to protect them. And steel has improved, Munro, chilled steel, Bessemer. Bessemer, very good. How much to cover a man? 14 inches by 12, meeting at an angle so that the bullet will glance. A notch at one side for the rifle. There you have it, laddie, the Cullingworth patent portable bulletproof shield. Weight. Oh, the weight would be 16 pounds. I worked it out. Each company carries its shields in go-karts, and they are served out on going into action. Give me 20,000 good shots, and I'll go in at Calais and come out at Pekin. Think of it, my boy, the moral effect. One side gets home every time, and the other plasters its bullets up against steel plates. No troops would stand it. The nation that gets it first will pitchfork the rest of Europe over the edge. They're bound to have it, all of them. Let's reckon it out. There's about 8 million of them on a war footing. Let us suppose that only half of them have it. I say only half, because I don't want to be too sanguine. That's 4 million, and I should take a royalty of 4 shillings on wholesale orders. What's that, Munro? About 750,000 sterling. How's that, laddie, What? Really, that is not unlike his style of talk, now that I come to read it over, only you miss the queer stops, the sudden confidential whispers, the roar with which he triumphantly answered his own questions, the shrugs and slaps and gesticulations. But not a word all the time as to what it was that made him send me that urgent wire which brought me to Avonmouth. I had, of course, been puzzling in my mind as to whether he had succeeded or not, though from his cheerful appearance and buoyant talk, it was tolerably clear to me that all was well with him. I was, however, surprised when, as we walked along a quiet, curving avenue, with great houses standing in their own grounds upon either side, he stopped and turned in through the iron gate, which led up to one of the finest of them. The moon had broken out and shone upon the high-peaked roof and upon the gables at each corner. When he knocked, it was opened by a footman with red plush knee breeches. I began to perceive that my friend's success must have been something colossal. When we came down to the dining room for supper, Mrs. Cullingworth was waiting there to greet me. I was sorry to see that she was pale and weary-looking. However, we had a merry meal in the old style, and her husband's animation reflected itself upon her face, until at last we might have been back in the little room, where the medical journals served as a chair, instead of in the great oak-furnished, picture-hung chamber to which we had been promoted. All the time, however, not one word as to the object of my journey. When the supper was finished, Cullingworth led the way into a small sitting-room where we both lit our pipes and Mrs. Cullingworth her cigarette. He sat for some little time in silence and then, bounding up, rushed to the door and flung it open. It is always one of his strange peculiarities to think that people are eavesdropping or conspiring against him, for in spite of his superficial brusqueness and frankness, a strange vein of suspicion runs through his singular and complex nature. Having satisfied himself now that there were no spies or listeners, he threw himself down into his armchair. "Munro," said he, prodding at me with his pipe, "what I wanted to tell you is that I am utterly, hopelessly, and irretrievably ruined." My chair was tilted on its back legs as he spoke, and I assure you that I was within an ace of going over. Down like a pack of cards came all my dreams as to the grand results which were to spring from my journey to Avonmouth. Yes, Bertie, I am bound to confess it. My first thought was of my own disappointment, and my second of the misfortune of my friends. He had the most diabolical intuitions, or I a very telltale face, for he added at once, "Sorry to disappoint you, my boy. That's not what you expected to hear, I can see." "Well," I stammered, "it is rather a surprise, old chap. I thought from the house and the footman and the furniture," said he. "Well, they've eaten me up among them, licked me clean, bones and gravy. I'm done for, my boy, unless—" Here I saw a question in his eyes. "Unless some friend were to lend me his name on a bit of stamped paper." "I can't do it, Cullingworth," said I. "It's a wretched thing to have to refuse a friend, and if I had money—" "Wait till you're asked, Munro," he interrupted, with his ugliest of expressions. "Besides, as you have nothing and no prospects, what earthly use would your name on a paper be?" "That's what I want to know," said I, feeling a little mortified none the less. "Look here, laddie," he went on, "do you see that pile of letters on the left of the table?" "Yes." "Those are Dunn's, and do you see those documents on the right? Well, those are county court summonses, and now, do you see that?" He picked up a little ledger and showed me 3 or 4 names scribbled on the first page. "That's the practice," he roared, and laughed until the great veins jumped out on his forehead. His wife laughed heartily also, just as she would have wept, had he been so disposed. "It's this way, Munro," said he, when he had got over his paroxysm. "You have probably heard, in fact, I have told you myself, that my father had the finest practice in Scotland. As far as I could judge, he was a man of no capacity, but still, there you are, he had it." I nodded and smoked. "Well, he's been dead 7 years, and 50 nets dipping into his little fish pond. However, when I passed, I thought my best move was to come down to the old place and see whether I couldn't piece the thing together again. The name ought to be worth something, I thought, but it was no use doing the thing in a half-hearted way. Not a bit of use in that, Munro. The kind of people who came to him were wealthy and must see a fine house and a man in livery. What chance was there of gathering them into a bow-windowed £40-a-year house with a grubby-faced maid at the door? What do you suppose I did? My boy, I took the governor's old house that was unlet, the very house that he kept up at £5,000 a year. Off I started in rare style and sank my last cent in furniture. But it's no use, laddie. I can't hold on any longer. I got 2 accidents and an epileptic, £22, 8 and 6pence. That's the lot." "What will you do, then?" "That's what I wanted your advice about. That's why I wired for you. I always respected your opinion, my boy, and I thought that now was the time to have it." It struck me that if he had asked for it 9 months before, there would have been more sense in it. What on earth could I do when affairs were in such a tangle? However, I could not help feeling complimented when so independent a fellow as Cullingworth turned to me in this way. "You really think," said I, "that it is no use holding on here?" He jumped up and began pacing the room in his swift, jerky way. "You take warning from it, Munro," said he. "You've got to start yet. Take my tip and go where no one knows you. People will trust a stranger quick enough, but if they can remember you as a little chap who ran about in knickerbockers and got spanked with a hairbrush for stealing plums, they are not going to put their lives in your keeping. It's all very well to talk about friendship and family connections, but when a man has a pain in the stomach, he doesn't care a toss about all that. I'd stick it up in gold, letters in every medical classroom, have it carved across the gate of the university, that if a man wants friends, he must go among strangers. It's all up here, Munro, so there's no use in advising me to hold on." I asked him how much he owed. It came to about £700. The rent alone was £200. He had already raised money on the furniture, and his whole assets came to less than a tenner. Of course, there was only one possible thing that I could advise. "You must call your creditors together," said I. "They can see for themselves that you are young and energetic, sure to succeed sooner or later. If they push you into a corner now, they can get nothing. Make that clear to them. But if you make a fresh start elsewhere and succeed, you may pay them all in full. I see no other possible way out of it." "I knew that you'd say that, and it's just what I thought myself. Isn't it, Hetty? Well then, that settles it, and I am much obliged to you for your advice, and that's all we'll say about the matter tonight. I've made my shot and missed. Next time I shall hit, and it won't be long either." His failure did not seem to weigh very heavily on his mind, for in a few minutes he was shouting away as lustily as ever. Whiskey and hot water were brought in, that we might all drink luck to the second venture. And this whiskey led us to what might have been a troublesome affair. Cullingworth, who had drunk off a couple of glasses, waited until his wife had left the room, and then began to talk of the difficulty of getting any exercise now that he had to wait in all day in the hope of patience. This led us round to the ways in which a man might take his exercise indoors, and that to boxing. Cullingworth took a couple of pairs of gloves out of a cupboard and proposed that we should fight a round or two then and there. If I hadn't been a fool, Bertie, I should never have consented. It's one of my many weaknesses that, whether it's a woman or a man, anything like a challenge sets me off. But I knew Cullingworth's ways, and I told you in my last what a lamb of a temper he has. None the less, we pushed back the table, put the lamp on a high bracket, and stood up to one another. The moment I looked him in the face, I smelled mischief. He had a gleam of settled malice in his eye. I believe it was my refusal to back his paper which was running in his head. Anyway, he looked as dangerous as he could look, with his scowling face sunk forward a little, his hands down near his hips, for his boxing, like everything else about him, is unconventional, and his jaw set like a rat trap. I led off, and then in he came, hitting with both hands and grunting like a pig at every blow. From what I could see of him, he was no boxer at all, but just a formidable rough and tumble fighter. I was guarding with both hands for half a minute, and then was rushed clean off my legs and banged up against the door, with my head nearly through one of the panels. He wouldn't stop then, though he saw that I had no space to get my elbows back, and he let fly a right-hander which would have put me into the hole if I hadn't slipped it and got back to the middle of the room. "Look here, Cullingworth," said I, "there's not much boxing about this game." "Yes, I hit pretty hard, don't I?" "If you come boring into me like that, I'm bound to hit you out again," I said. "I want to play light if you'll let me." The words were not out of my mouth before he was on me like a flash. I slipped him again, but the room was so small, and he as active as a cat, that there was no getting away from him. He was on me once more with a regular football rush that knocked me off my balance. Before I knew where I was, he got his left on the mark and his right on my ear. I tripped over a footstool, and then before I could get my balance, he had me on the same ear again, and my head was singing like a tea kettle. He was as pleased as possible with himself, blowing out his chest and slapping it with his palms as he took his place in the middle of the room. "Say when you've had enough, Munro," said he. This was pretty stiff, considering that I had 2 inches the better of him in height and as many stone in weight, besides being the better boxer. His energy and the size of the room had been against me so far, but he wasn't to have all the slogging to himself in the next round if I could help it. In he came with one of his windmill rushes, but I was on the lookout for him this time. I landed him with my left a regular nose-ender as he came, and then, ducking under his left, I got him a cross-counter on the jaw that laid him flat across his own hearthrug. He was up in an instant, with a face like a madman. "You swine," he shouted, "take those gloves off and put your hands up." He was tugging at his own to get them off. "Go on, you silly ass," said I, "what is there to fight about?" He was mad with passion and chucked his gloves down under the table. "By God, Munro," he cried, "if you don't take those gloves off, I'll go for you, whether you have them on or not." "Have a glass of soda water," said I. He made a crack at me. "You're afraid of me, Munro, that's what's the matter with you," he snarled. This was getting too hot, Bertie. I saw all the folly of the thing. I believed that I might whip him, but at the same time, I knew that we were so much of a match that we would both get pretty badly cut up without any possible object to serve. For all that, I took my gloves off, and I think perhaps it was the wisest course after all. If Cullingworth once thought he had the whiff end of you, you might be sorry for it afterwards. But as fate would have it, our little Barney was nipped in the bud. Mrs. Cullingworth came into the room at that instant and screamed out when she saw her husband. His nose was bleeding, and his chin was all slobbered with blood, so that I don't wonder that it gave her a turn. "James," she screamed, and then to me, "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Munro?" You should have seen the hatred in her dove's eyes. I felt an insane impulse to pick her up and kiss her. "We've only been having a little spar, Mrs. Cullingworth," said I. "Your husband was complaining that he never got any exercise." "It's all right, Hetty," said he, pulling his coat on again. "Don't be a little stupid. Are the servants gone to bed? Well, you might bring some water in a basin from the kitchen. Sit down, Munro, and light your pipe again. I have 100 things that I want to talk to you about." So that was the end of it, and all went smoothly for the rest of the evening. But for all that, the little wife will always look upon me as a brute and a bully, while as to Cullingworth, well, it's rather difficult to say what Cullingworth thinks about the matter. When I woke next morning, he was in my room, and a funny-looking object he was. His dressing gown lay on a chair, and he was putting up a 56-pound dumbbell without a rag to cover him. Nature didn't give him a very symmetrical face, nor the sweetest of expressions, but he has a figure like a Greek statue. I was amused to see that both his eyes had a touch of shadow to them. It was his turn to grin when I sat up and found that my ear was about the shape and consistence of a toadstool. However, he was all for peace that morning and chatted away in the most amiable manner possible. I was to go back to my father's that day, but I had a couple of hours with Cullingworth in his consulting room before I left. He was in his best form and full of 100 fantastic schemes by which I was to help him. His great object was to get his name into the newspapers. That was the basis of all success, according to his views. It seemed to me that he was confounding cause with effect, but I did not argue the point. I laughed until my sides ached over the grotesque suggestions which poured from him. I was to lie senseless in the roadway and to be carried into him by a sympathizing crowd, while the footman ran with a paragraph to the newspapers. But there was the likelihood that the crowd might carry me in to the rival practitioner opposite. In various disguises, I was to feign fits at his very door, and so furnish fresh copy for the local press. Then I was to die absolutely to expire, and all Scotland was to resound with how Dr. Cullingworth of Avonmouth had resuscitated me. His ingenious brain rang 1,000 changes out of the idea, and his own impending bankruptcy was crowded right out of his thoughts by the flood of half-serious devices. But the thing that took the fun out of him and made him gnash his teeth and stride cursing about the room was to see a patient walking up the steps which led to the door of Scarsdale, his opposite neighbor. Scarsdale had a fairly busy practice and received his people at home from 10 to 12, so that I got quite used to seeing Cullingworth fly out of his chair and rush raving to the window. He would diagnose the cases, too, and estimate their money value until he was hardly articulate. "There you are," he would suddenly yell. "See that man with a limp? Every morning he goes, displaced semilunar cartilage and a 3 months' job. The man's worth 35 shillings a week. And there, I'm hanged if the woman with the rheumatic arthritis isn't round in her bath chair again. She's all sealskin and lactic acid. It's simply sickening to see how they crowd to that man. And such a man, you haven't seen him, all the better for you. I don't know what the devil you are laughing at, Munro. I can't see where the fun comes in myself." Well, it was a short experience, that visit to Avonmouth, but I think that I shall remember it all my life. Goodness knows, you must be sick enough of the subject, but when I started with so much detail, I was tempted to go. It ended by my going back again in the afternoon, Cullingworth assuring me that he would call his creditors together as I had advised, and that he would let me know the result in a few days. Mrs. C. would hardly shake hands with me when I said goodbye, but I like her the better for that. He must have a great deal of good in him, or he could not have won her love and confidence so completely. Perhaps there is another Cullingworth behind the scenes, a softer, tenderer man who can love and invite love. If there is, I have never got near him, and yet I may only have been tapping at the shell. Who knows? For that matter, it is likely enough that he has never got at the real Johnny Munro. But you have, Bertie, and I think that you've had a little too much of him this time, only you encourage me to this sort of excess by your sympathetic replies. Well, I've done as much as the General Post Office will carry for 5p, so I'll conclude by merely remarking that a fortnight has passed, and that I have had no news from Avonmouth, which does not in the very slightest degree surprise me. If I ever do hear anything, which is exceedingly doubtful, you may be sure that I will put a finish to this long story.